Yes, hello. Today we are going to talk about Book 23 of the Odyssey, the penultimate book. And yeah, this is one of the most famous of all the moments in the Odyssey, and as we are going to see, rightly so. So the book opens with a chuckling maid, right? Um, Eurycleia, who is the old nursemaid who recognized Odysseus originally, right, by the scar on his foot, comes to announce to Penelope that the king has returned, right, that he is back. And she, of course, initially does not believe Eurycleia. And this, in part, is because the Book 23, is going to introduce us to a way in which we all have a tendency to deceive ourselves when it comes to the things that we desire. So at first, Penelope accuses the old maid of being crazy, right? She says, You're insane. There's no way that Odysseus could be back, right? He's lost at sea, and forever will never to return. The gods have made you crazy. You used to be so sensible. So the poem has a moment where it is signaling to the readers, pay attention to this, because we are now entering the realm of the way in which love, desire, hope can distort our perception and make us see things that are not there. And this is going to be characterized both as a weakness, as a vulnerability, and also as a key feature of love. So, in the conversation between Penelope and Eurycleia, we recognize that the Odyssey is mostly concerned with intimacy, right? That the subject is about, in part, how intimacy structures the world just as much as decisions made from a position of political power or armies clashing on a field, that intimacy sets the stage and configures the world itself, that conversations that we have, connections we make, the ways that we understand one another, that this leads to direct outcomes and shapes reality. So, social psychologists for decades now have been talking about how gossip, that is, the exchange of social information, is much of what humans participate in. It's much of what we do in one form or another. We could see many of our entertainments as simply being forms of gossip, as exchanging this information. And so rather than treat gossip lightly, this book correctly places it at the center of the action. And that's going to be extremely important. So again, the question of how we know each other. How do we know who we are to one another? How can we really experience this sense of knowing someone who in one way or another will always remain a stranger sealed in a black box? One way in which the poem says we can know each other is through our wounds, right? It's through the evidence of the suffering that others have experienced. This is the significance of the healed scar on Odysseus's foot that is the sign by which he shows himself to others, and his old nursemaid, the slave Eurycleia, brings us up to Penelope. She says, I know it's Odysseus because of his scar, right? And again, Penelope says, yes, but even things that we know to be true, signs that we see as deep truths of who each other are, can deceive us because of our desire, right? She refers to the gods playing tricks, right? And the cruelty of reality, of the way in which we think that something is going to unfold the way we desperately would like it to be unfolding, and then we are shocked and surprised and hurt when it does not. And Penelope is guarding herself against this, right? But again, the poem is saying, look at this type of woman, observe her, and also see the power of her love, right? The reason that she's so guarded is because the love that she feels is overwhelming, and it could overwhelm her, kind of like a tidal wave or a tsunami. So finally, she comes down to the hall, and you know, Odysseus is there, presumably to some extent drenched in blood, right? So Eurycleia begins by saying, you would be so turned on by him because of how much he has like slaughtered the suitors. So there is this sense in part that the vengeance that he has wreaked upon these unscrupulous men makes him more a desirable figure. And yet, when she comes down to the hall, perhaps the history, that all the things that they have gone through are just so overwhelming that she cannot bring herself to embrace him, and indeed is still not convinced that this is indeed Odysseus, that this could be either somebody masquerading as him or perhaps, a cruel trick of the gods. One of the interesting things is that both Odysseus and Penelope cannot look each other in the eye when they first encounter each other as Odysseus and Penelope. Recall that they had a long and intimate conversation when Odysseus was disguised as a beggar. Now that they know who each other are, they are at a loss for words. And both of their minds are sort of whirling uncontrollably. The poet here introduces a kind of another aside at which, Telemachus kind of, in his petulant way, rages at his mom for not embracing her husband. And this, once again, is a sign of how Telemachus is still kind of a child in his sort of sulky teenager behavior towards his mother, right? He hasn't quite grown up, even after all the events that have unfolded. So by this, we see that he is still a child. Odysseus is still the father. The family unit is, in a sense, all there, ready to be reconnected, but it just hasn't yet. So one of the difficult things, of course, is that even as they're sitting there, Odysseus and they kind of collectively realize the consequences of what they have done, right? Which are going to be in a very unsatisfying way dealt with in Book 24. But the fact that they've just slaughtered the suitors, right? And the poem makes it clear that the suitors are not to be seen simply as, bad guys to be vanquished, right? That they are young men who are crucial and important to the future of Ithaca. And the poem decidedly rejects some kind of notion that the suitors don't matter or don't count. In other words, the poem wants us to refocus our attention on the consequences of violence, even violence that is in some sense justified or legal or satisfying emotionally. So that's it for now, and we'll come back for round 2 in a second.